So this is continuing in Module 3. I just called it Module 3.1 because we're just continuing on the same topic that we talked about last time, race and logical fallacies. We're going to go a little bit into a little more detail about race as a logical fallacy, and we're going to also look at an article, actually a couple of articles that sort of talk about this. So this should look familiar to you because we talked about this last time. Logical fallacies are, it's just a fancy way of saying that they are defects in our thinking that weaken our arguments. And so a fallacy in logic means that you are making these different kinds of connections that don't make sense. They don't make sense, and therefore they weaken our arguments. But the thing about logical fallacies is that they're very common. You see them every day. You probably are watching them on TV, listening to them on the radio. If you see comedians, they do these all the time, and they make fun of logical fallacies because we all know that we all do them, and yet it's just human nature to continue doing these things. So sometimes they're subtle, other times they're very obvious, but they are very persuasive because they immediately appeal. They want you to respond with your gut reaction, not to logical, critical thinking. So that's why the more that we develop our critical thinking skills, the more you will recognize these fallacies and the more apparent they will be when you encounter them. And then you will recognize that people are doing this purposely so that they can manipulate the way that you think, so they can manipulate your reaction. So that's why it's very common to see them in advertising, marketing schemes, different things that want you to buy their product. They're appealing to the fact that you're going to make this logical fallacy and just react with your gut. So because if you are able to then recognize the fallacies, then you're less vulnerable to falling prey to them, and you're also less vulnerable to this concept called groupthink, which is something I talked about quickly last time. But basically, it's what it sounds like. It's thinking like the majority, just kind of following along with what people expect you to do because that's what everybody else is doing. Critical thinking will help you to not do that or to recognize that that's what's going on, and then you can choose to respond with the majority, or you may choose to respond in a more independent manner. But as long as you recognize that that's what's happening, then you're exercising your critical thinking skills. So the big question of this module is racism a logical fallacy? And this is something that the readings, the videos, the episode that you're watching really talks about in a bunch of different ways. So for here, I just included the definition of racism just so you could see. And there's a couple that are out there. This one I took from the Anti-Defamation League, which by its name is a nonprofit that's it's about anti-defamation, so anti-racism. And so this is how they say that. They say racism is a belief that a particular race is superior or inferior to another, and that a person's social and moral traits are predetermined by his or her inborn biological characteristics. And they say racial separatism is the belief, most of the time based on racism, that different races should remain segregated and apart from one another. So this is how the ADL defines racism. You can look it up in the dictionary. The dictionary definition was just a little bit more stiff and awkward. I like the way this one flowed. But it basically says the same thing. So how do you see race as a logical fallacy? Oh, this is the link to the ADL website on racism. And they have an article that talks about how racism has existed throughout human history and tells you basically that this is why racism is a logical fallacy. So for the past, if you just look at our history, in the past 500 to 1,000 years, racism on the part of Western powers towards non-Westerners has had a very significant impact on history, especially here in our country, and in Europe, you could say too, because the most notorious example of racism by the West has been slavery. Slavery existed here, as we know, but it also existed in other countries around the world. and particularly the enslavement of Africans in the New World. So Africans were used as slaves not just here, but also in Europe as well. And there are examples that Africans enslaved one another, and I'm sure there's examples in Asia where people are exploiting one another too. But we're talking about here in this country mostly. So enslavement was accomplished because the racist belief that Black Africans were less fully human than white Europeans and their descendants. And this is now we're getting to the fallacy part, because they believed, all these Europeans believed that any Black person was genetically inferior and therefore they were not fully human. And that's what allowed them to do the horrible things that they did to Black people, because that was their belief. And so, because they were not, but Africans were not originally considered inferior. It went way back when the Portuguese sailors actually explored the world and they went to Africa in the early 15th, 16th centuries. They actually found empires and cities very advanced, and as advanced as their own, and they considered these African nations to be very serious rivals to Portugal and to other European countries that were set on conquering the world. But as we saw over time, these African civilizations didn't keep up with European technological advances. And that's when we really saw when the Europeans started sailing around the world and conquering and colonizing all of these different places, primarily in Africa, also in Asia, all over the world, really. And this is really where they started to actually forcibly remove their inhabitants and make them work as slaves in new colonies across the Atlantic. And so in the United States, prior to it, actually, was it the United States? Yeah, I guess so. In the United States, the new colony, and then in the Caribbean as well. Also in South America, there were a lot of slave laborers. The slave trade went all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And so this is where we get to be this logical fallacy, where Africans came to be as a deficient species, and they were called savages. This view was necessary to justify the types of subhuman, inhuman behavior that these Westerners, supposedly civilized people, were doing to another species, they called them, of people. Because in their own culture, in Western culture, they had started to promote this concept of individual rights and human equality, yet this is what they were doing to these African people. So in order for them to justify to themselves that it was okay to say that they were defending individual rights and human equality, yet still engage in this slave trade, they had to make this leap in logic and say, well, they're not really human like we are, therefore they don't deserve the kind of equality that white men have. And so that's what helped them to justify slavery for hundreds of years. And so what the carryover today is that the focus of racism is still this concept of inferiority that's been ingrained in human brains for many, many, many years, many hundreds, even thousands of years, I guess. So, but one important feature of racism is clear in that their attitudes regarding slaves and slavery, like I said, is that blacks and others are seen by racists as merely subhuman, and that's why they do not deserve the same rights and privileges that other human people have. They saw them more like beasts or animals than they did men or women or children. And so in the second half of the 19th century, Darwinism was the decline in Christian belief and more into the scientific origins of human. And their growing immigration of different people from all over the world coming to the Western nations, primarily here, we're going to concentrate here in the U.S. These were all perceived by many white Westerners as a threat to their cultural control. And so this is what led, I don't know what led, but they happened around the same time, and it reinforced this belief that people who were not white Westerners were not fully human. this is where we get this whole racial science thing. The European and American scientists and philosophers and sociologists, I would say, devised this sort of false racial science to quote unquote prove the supremacy of whites, specifically non-Jewish whites, and at the same time arguing the inborn shortcomings of certain races, especially blacks in the beginning. They also used it to argue the shortcomings of indigenous Native Americans, and then later on, people coming from Latin America who were brown also. Then later on, people coming from Asia who were not white Westerners as well. And so this quote unquote racial science was devised and used to uphold this whole system of racism in the United States. And so this is kind of where we see vestiges of this whole perceived by white Westerners as a threat to their cultural control, even today, right? Because there's all these arguments about immigrants, illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants wanting to build a wall. All of these kinds of things are all harkening back to this era where white Westerners, white Western people are seeing anyone that does not look like them as a threat to the cultural control of the United States. So that's what I see going on. I don't know what you all see going on. What do you think? Any opinions on that? I think a lot of it has to do with the shifting demographics of our country, because white people are no longer going to be the majority if they aren't already. I think fairly soon, in like, I don't know, a matter of 10, 20 years, they will no longer be the dominant majority. And so because of that, a lot of people are feeling that we're losing our control, we're losing our culture. The whole Make America Great Again, it wasn't really great for non-white people back in the day, but it was fine if you were the one doing the slave trade and making all kinds of money off of your free labor who were picking your crops and not, you don't have to pay any wages for them. So that's kind of where a lot of the roots of racism, you can look back and see where these ideas came from. So all of these ideas and arguments are based on this false understanding of race that contemporary scientists recognize, and they do not agree on any kinds of ways that race is a valid way to classify people. And what people people on the street, everyday people might see as significant racial differences, like your skin color, your hair color, the texture of your hair, your face shape, your eye shape, any of these things, really are not of much scientific significance when you look down at our DNA and the genetics and all of that stuff. So there have been many, many studies that prove that even within a so-called race, quote unquote, the differences within that race are greater, or they can be greater than those between races. So if you just take a group of white Europeans from one region, from, let's say, Great Britain, you can find as many differences within all of those people as you can if you looked at them compared to Africans from Zaire or something. The only outward differences you see, obviously, are the skin color, the hair texture, and whatnot. But if you really look at the genes, there's not much difference. And so the difference is, this is a quote from a philosopher, that most deeply affect us in our dealings with each other, are not to any significant significant degree biologically determined. It's more